Hi all, today we'll discuss about Java interview questions, Java real-time interview questions day 1. So I am starting all the Java interview questions which is real-time interview questions related for fresher and experience based on Java with Spring Boot microservices, Spring Cloud component, AWS, full stack with React Angular, database and all. And also it will include the DevOps. So whatever the interviewer questions will be asked, so day by day we will collect all the interview questions related for this technology and will update the same. So right now which I have collected is a Java with Spring Boot microservice real-time interview question. So the first question is what is difference between JDK, JRE and JVM? So JDK development kit is a software development kit used to develop a Java application. It includes JRE, compiler and tools. So JDK will part of JRE, compiler and tools. So what is JRE? So JRE is a Java runtime environment which provide a library and JVM required to run a Java applications. Now the next is what is JVM? It's a virtual machine. Execute Java bytecode and provide a platform independent execution environment. So this is the difference of Java, JDK, JRE and JVM. Now the next question is what is the difference between equal and double equal? So what is the difference between double equal and dot equals in Java? So double equal compare object reference, memory address and dot equals compare the actual content or value object overridden in the class like strings and all. So this is the main difference of double equal and dot equals. So dot equals is method. Now the next question is what are the principle of OOPS? So there are OOPS principle is encapsulation, inheritance, polymorphism, abstractions. So encapsulation means building the data and methods that operate on the data. Inheritance means creating a new class from existing class. That is called inheritance. Polymorphism means ability to take a many form like overriding, overloadings and all will the part of polymorphism. Abstraction means hiding the implementation detail and showing only functionality is called abstraction, which we call APIE, abstraction, polymorphism, encapsulation, inheritance is part of OOPS principle. Now the next question is what is the difference between array list and linked list is part of collection framework. So what is the difference between array list and linked list? So array list backed by dynamic array provide fast random access but slow insertion and deletion. So array list mostly used to fast the random access. If you want to fast random access, in that cases we'll go for the array list, but not for insertion and deletion. Only for fast to search a random access and all. Now linked list. Linked list backed a double linked list which provide fastest insertion deletion but slower random access. So linked list is used for insertion and deletion, but array list is used for random access. So in linked list random access will slow, but in array list random access will be fast. Now the next question is what is final keyword in Java? Final can be applied to variable, method and class. So if you applied in variable cannot be reassigned. If you applied in method cannot be overridden. If you applied in class cannot be inherited. Now the next question is what is difference between a string buffer and a string builder? So a string immutable and thread safe. A string builder is mutable but not a thread safe. But in a string buffer is mutable and thread safe. What is the next question is what is lambda expression in Java? So this is a part of Java 8. So what is lambda expression? A concise way to represent an anonymous functions. A concise way to represent an anonymous function introduced in Java 8 is called lambda function. So suppose this is a to a and b. and this is the lambda functions a plus b here. Now the next question is, what is optional class in Java? Optional class, a container object that may or may not contain a null value, non-null value, used to avoid null pointer exception. If a container object may or may not have a non-null value, used to avoid a null pointer exception, in that cases we will use a optional class in Java. Now it's a features of Java 8. Now the next question is, what is the difference between checked and unchecked exception? So the checked exception is compile time. It's called IO exception. Unchecked exception is a runtime. It's called null pointer exception. Is an example. So checked exception as compile time means input output exception, and unchecked exception is a null pointer exception that is called at the runtime. Now what is volatile keyword in Java? Ensure visibility of changes to variable across thread. Ensure visibility of changes to variable across the thread. It prevents thread caching of variable. Now the next question is Spring Boot related interview questions. So the first question is related for a Spring Boot. What is a Spring Boot? So Spring Boot build on top of a Spring framework to simplify development of a standalone production grade Spring Boot application. So the next question is, what is the advantage of a Spring Boot? So auto configuration, embedded server, Tomcat or Jetty, production ready features like metrics, health check, and no XML configuration. So these all are the advantage of a Spring Boot. Now the next question is, what is the difference between controller and REST controller? Controller is used for the traditional web applications that return view, and REST controller is used for the RESTful web services and return JSON XML represents. It's called REST controller. Now the next question is, what is the purpose of at the rate Spring Boot application annotation? So a combination of configuration, enable auto configuration and component scale annotation. It make main class of a Spring Boot application. It marks the main class of a Spring Boot application. Now the next question is, what is a Spring Boot actuator? A Spring Boot actuator provide production ready features like health check, metrics, monitor of a Spring Boot application. Now the next question is, how do you handle exception in Spring Boot? Use controller advice or exception handler to create a global exception handler. So how we will create an exception handler? Use a custom exception handler which is used to create a global exception handler. So how we will handle this Spring Boot? Either we will go for the controller advice or exception and handler. Now the next question is, what is the difference between path variable and request param? Path variable extract value from URI and request param. What is the difference between path variable and request param? Path variable extract value from the URI path, and param extract the value from the URI parameters. So now the next question is, what is the dependency injection in Spring? So a design patterns where objects are injected. A design pattern where objects are injected by the Spring container rather than created by the application is called dependency injection in Spring. So a design pattern which is used objects are injected by a Spring container rather than created the application. Now the next question is, what is the difference between auto wire and resource? So auto wire is a Spring specific inject by the type, and resource is at the rate resource is a Java specific and inject by name. So at the rate autowired is a Spring specific and inject by type, and resource is a Java specific inject by name. Now the next question is, what is Spring Data JPA? A framework that simplify data access using JPA, Java Persistent API, and provide repository support. Now we will go for the microservice interview questions. So here we will consider the microservice related questions. So what is microservices? An architectural style where applications are built as a collections of small independent and loosely coupled services. What are the advantage of microservices? So microservices advantage is scalability, flexibility, independent deployment, and technology diversity. Now the next question is, what is the difference between monolithic and microservices architecture? So monolithic means single code base, tightly coupled, harder to scale. Microservice means multiple independent service, loose coupled, and easier to scale. Now the next question is, what is API gateway in microservice? A single entry point for all client requests, which route a request to the appropriate microservices. A single entry point for all client requests, which route request to the appropriate microservices. Now the next question is, what is service discovery in microservice? A mechanism for microservices to find and communicate with each other dynamically. Example, Netflix Eureka. What is what is service discovery in microservice? A mechanism of microservices to find and communicate with each others dynamically. Netflix and Eureka. Now the next question is, what is the role of Docker in microservices? So Docker is used to containerized microservices, ensure consistency across development, testing, and production environment. Now the next question is, what is the difference between synchronous asynchronous communication in microservices? So synchronous and synchronous. Synchronous client wait for a response. For that REST API we will use. Asynchronous client does not wait for the response. It's called asynchronous. That is called message queue like Kafka and all. Now the next question is, what is circuit breaker pattern? Circuit breaker pattern in microservices, a design pattern that prevent cascading failures by stopping requests to failing a services is called pattern, circuit breaker pattern like heuristics and all. So design patterns that prevent cascading failures by stopping request or failing services. Now the next question is, what is the difference between REST and gRPC? REST is used for HTTP, JSON, text-based, and human readable, but gRPC is used for HTTP/2, binary-based and faster. Now the next question is, what is the role of Kubernetes in microservices? So Kubernetes is used for container orchestration, scaling, and managing microservice in production. Now we'll discuss the real-time scenario-based interview questions. What is related for the projects and all. Now the next question is, how would you handle database transaction in microservices architecture? So using distributed transaction, use distributed transactions like saga pattern or eventual consistency. Now the next question, how do you secure a Spring Boot? So using a Spring security for authentication and authorizations like Auth2, JWT, and HTTPS. Now the next question is, how do you monitor microservice in production using tools like Prometheus, Grafana, and Spring Boot actuators. Prometheus, Grafana, and Spring Boot actuators used for the monitor the microservices in production. The next question is, how do you handle versioning in REST API? So using URI versioning, v1/resource or headers versioning. Now the next question is, how do you optimize the performance of a Spring Boot application using caching, Redis connection pooling, or asynchronous processing? So this that way, by using caching, Redis connection pooling, and asynchronous processing. Now now the next is, how do you handle configuration in microservices architecture? So Spring Boot, use Spring Cloud Config or Kubernetes config map. How do you handle configuration in microservice space using Spring Cloud Config or Kubernetes config map? Now the next question is, how do you ensure data consistency across microservices? So use event driven architectures and eventual consistency. Now the next question is, how do you handle logging in distributed system? So using centralized logging tools like ELK Stack, Elasticsearch, Logstash, Kibana, as now. Now the next question is, how do you implement retry logic in microservices? So use a Spring retry or resilience patterns like circuit breaker. Now the next question is, how do you handle cross-cutting concern in Spring Boot? So use aspect oriented programming AOP at the rate aspect at the rate arounds and all. Now the next question is advanced questions, which is related for the real time interview project related interview questions. So what is the difference between mock, inject mock in Mockito? So mock create a mock object, inject mock create mock inject mock into the class under test. Mock create a mock object and inject mock into the class under test. Now the what is the difference between qualifier primary in Spring Boot? Qualifier specified which beans to inject when multiple beans having same type of exit. At the rate primary mark has been for default choice. The next question is, what is the difference between at the rate component scan, at the rate service, and at the rate repository? Now the next question is, what is the difference between at the rate configuration and at the rate component? Now the next question is, what is the difference between request scope and session scope? So these all are the annotations which we are using in microservices Spring Boot patterns. The next question is, what is the difference between at the rate enable auto configurations and component scan? The next question is, what is the difference between arrest controller and controller? What is the difference between path variable and request param? The next question is, what is the difference between auto wire and resource? So, and the last question is, what is the difference between at the rate Spring Boot application and at the rate enable auto configuration? So these all are the related for Spring Boot microservices Java real-time interview questions, which is very important in interview.